You ever been called dead weight while holding the only key that keeps the entire ship from sinking? I have. And when they fired me to save a few pennies, they had no idea I was clutching the lifeline that every contract, every operating permit they proudly displayed on their walls, depended on. Want to know what happened when they discovered that little detail? Settle in. You won't believe what's waiting at the end of this tale. My name is Margaret Sutton, and at 42, I thought I'd seen every flavor of corporate backstabbing Portland had to offer. I was wrong. Dead wrong. For 8 years, I'd been the director of legal operations and licensing at Orion Ventures, a biotech company that specialized in cutting-edge medical devices. Think surgical robots that could perform heart surgery with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Diagnostic equipment that could detect cancer cells the size of pinheads. Machines that literally saved lives every single day. Beautiful, complex, and highly regulated technology that required more federal permits than a nuclear power plant. Every morning, I'd arrive at our glass-walled headquarters on the 20th floor, coffee in hand, looking out over the Willamette River while reviewing license renewal applications that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. Patent registrations, FDA compliance certificates, international export authorizations, biometric security clearances, all stamped with my unique digital signature and linked to my personal federal compliance identification number. It was tedious work, sure, but it was also the invisible foundation that kept our $100 million operation running legally. The irony wasn't lost on me that while everyone else got to work on the sexy stuff, the engineering breakthroughs, the investor presentations, the glossy marketing campaigns, I was the one making sure we wouldn't get shut down by federal regulators. I was the adult in the room, the one who read the fine print, the person who understood that innovation without proper authorization was just expensive junk gathering dust in a warehouse. But that was before Zachary Hunt arrived like a plague of locusts in an expensive suit. Our previous CEO, Dr. Patricia Hoffman, had been a scientist first and a businesswoman second. She understood that compliance wasn't just about checking boxes. It was about building sustainable operations that could weather regulatory storms. When she announced her retirement, the board decided they needed someone with fresh energy and aggressive growth strategies. Translation: they wanted someone young and ruthless enough to squeeze more profit from the same operations. Enter Zachary Hunt, 34 years old, MBA from Wharton, and a resume that read like a corporate body count. His specialty was operational restructuring, which sounded much more professional than firing people to boost quarterly earnings. He'd cut his teeth at 3 different tech companies, each time arriving like the efficiency expert and leaving behind a trail of pink slips and hollow-eyed survivors grateful to still have jobs. I remember his first company-wide meeting vividly. He strutted into our main conference room wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His perfectly styled hair catching the light from our floor-to-ceiling windows. He had that particular brand of corporate charisma that seemed to mesmerize younger employees. All confidence and buzzwords wrapped in the promise of stock options and rapid advancement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that trained MBA cadence that made even mundane statements sound revolutionary. "We're not here to maintain the status quo. We're here to disrupt it. Orion Ventures has incredible technology, brilliant minds, and untapped potential. What we don't need are legacy systems that slow us down." Legacy systems. I felt a chill run down my spine. In corporate speak, legacy was usually code for old and expensive, and in a room full of bright-eyed engineers and ambitious salespeople, I was definitely the grayest head in the crowd. He clicked to his first PowerPoint slide. Vision 2.0. Optimize resources, eliminate redundancies, maximize agility. Each bullet point appeared with a subtle whoosh sound effect that made the presentation feel like a TED Talk about the future of work. Some traditional roles, he continued, his eyes scanning the room with practiced intensity, will be streamlined to align with our high-velocity operational model. We're not just updating our technology, we're updating our entire organizational philosophy. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. I watched my younger colleagues nodding eagerly, already imagining themselves as part of this brave new corporate world. Sarah Chen from marketing was practically beaming. Dave Rodriguez from engineering looked like he'd just been offered the keys to the kingdom. I sat quietly in the back, taking notes not on his inspirational rhetoric, but on the careful legal language he was using. Streamlined, traditional roles, high-velocity operational model. Every phrase was designed to sound innovative while actually meaning something much more ominous for anyone over 40. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 8 years at Orion Ventures. I started creating backup copies of every critical licensing document we held, not because I was paranoid, but because I was experienced. I'd seen enough corporate restructurings to know that the first casualties were always the people who were perceived as process-heavy rather than results-driven. Our licensing database contained 47 active federal permits, each one representing months of paperwork, thousands of dollars in application fees, and countless hours of coordination with regulatory agencies. Every single permit was tied to my personal compliance identification number, a biometric system that the FDA had implemented to prevent licensing fraud. It wasn't just my name on the paperwork, it was my fingerprints, my retinal scan, my digital signature algorithm. But here's the thing that Zachary and his MBA brain probably didn't understand. You can't just transfer these kinds of federal authorizations like you'd reassign someone's email account. The licensing system was designed specifically to prevent corporate shell games and regulatory arbitrage. When I signed up for those compliance credentials 8 years ago, I'd essentially become the human keystone holding up our entire legal operation. I spent the next 3 days quietly downloading and encrypting copies of every permit, license, and federal authorization we held. Call it professional paranoia. But I had a feeling I was going to need them. The second shoe dropped 2 weeks later with an email that landed in my inbox at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The subject line read, Legacy Cost Reduction Initiative, Phase 1, Assessment. The email was from someone named Connor Blair, who identified himself as a process optimization consultant reporting directly to Zachary. I'd never heard of Connor Blair, which meant he was either very new or very unimportant. Turns out, he was both. Connor requested a meeting to review current operational workflows and identify efficiency opportunities within the legal and licensing department. The corporate speak was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What he really meant was, we want to figure out if we can fire you and give your job to someone cheaper. I agreed to meet with him that Friday afternoon, curious to see what flavor of hatchet man Zachary had hired to do his dirty work. Connor turned out to be exactly what I expected. 28 years old, fresh MBA from Northwestern, wearing a slightly too big suit that suggested he was still adjusting to corporate life after a few years in consulting. He had that eager, hungry look that young business school graduates get when they think they're about to make their mark on the world. Margaret, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with his iPad and coffee. I've been reviewing your department's operational metrics, and I have to say, there are some fascinating opportunities for modernization here. Fascinating opportunities. I almost smiled. This kid had no idea what he was walking into. I'm always interested in improving our processes, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. What specific opportunities did you have in mind? Connor launched into a 20-minute presentation about automation potential and workflow optimization. That basically boiled down to, most of what I did could probably be handled by software or delegated to junior staff. He'd clearly spent considerable time preparing charts and graphs that showed how my salary could be reallocated to more growth-focused initiatives. The thing is, he continued, pulling up a spreadsheet on his iPad. A lot of the licensing work seems pretty routine. File renewals, track deadlines, submit paperwork. With the right systems in place, we could probably handle 90% of this with automated processes and maybe one junior associate. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were genuinely considering his proposal. That's an interesting perspective. Connor, have you had a chance to review the specific compliance requirements for our federal licensing system? Well, not the technical details, he admitted, but that's really more of an implementation question. The strategic question is whether we need a senior-level position dedicated to what's essentially administrative work. Administrative work. There it was. 8 years of navigating federal bureaucracy, building relationships with regulatory officials, and ensuring that our company stayed on the right side of laws that could shut us down overnight. All reduced to administrative work by someone who'd probably never filed a permit application in his life. I understand your perspective, I said carefully. Would you like me to walk you through some of the specific requirements we deal with? It might help you get a better sense of the complexity involved. For the next hour, I gave Connor a masterclass in regulatory compliance that left his eyes glazed over. I explained the intricacies of FDA Class 3 medical device licensing, the Byzantine requirements for international export authorizations, the quarterly reporting obligations that required precise technical specifications, and the biometric security protocols that governed access to our manufacturing permits. By the end of our meeting, Connor looked like he'd been hit by a truck full of government forms, but instead of backing down from his assessment, he doubled down on it. This just reinforces my point, he said, packing up his iPad with the confidence of someone who'd clearly missed the entire point of the conversation. All of this complexity suggests we need better systems, not more expensive personnel. With the right automation tools, we could streamline these processes significantly. I realized then that Connor wasn't stupid. He was just operating from a completely different playbook. His job wasn't to understand our operations. It was to justify reducing our costs. And in his world, every problem could be solved with better software and cheaper labor. I'll put together some recommendations for Zachary, he concluded, standing up and straightening his tie. I think there are some real opportunities here to modernize your department's approach. After he left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the Portland skyline and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine concern about my job security. Not because I thought I was bad at what I did, but because I was beginning to understand that competence wasn't going to be the deciding factor in whatever was coming next. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I carefully reviewed the termination clause in my employment contract. Buried in Section 14B, subsection 3, was a paragraph I'd never paid much attention to when I signed my original offer letter 8 years ago. In the event of involuntary termination of employee, all federal compliance credentials, licensing authorizations, and regulatory permissions associated with employees' personal identification shall be considered void and subject to immediate cancellation within 72 hours of termination notification. I read that paragraph 3 times, each time with growing amazement. The legal department that had drafted my contract, probably some law firm that specialized in biotech companies, had included a clause that essentially made me a human failsafe. If Orion Ventures fired me, they'd automatically lose access to every federal permit and license I held on their behalf. At the time I signed the contract, this clause probably seemed like a reasonable protection for both parties. The company got assurance that I couldn't take their licenses with me if I quit, and I got assurance that I couldn't be fired and immediately replaced without proper transition procedures. It was designed to encourage good faith negotiations and orderly transitions. But now, facing what looked like an imminent restructuring by people who didn't understand our regulatory environment, that clause had become something much more powerful, a nuclear option. I made copies of my contract and locked them in my home safe, along with encrypted backups of our entire licensing database. Then I did something that probably violated several company policies. I researched the exact procedures for voluntary license cancellation with the FDA, the Department of Commerce, and the International Trade Administration. Turns out, it was surprisingly simple. A few online forms, a biometric confirmation, and a 72-hour waiting period. After that, every permit we held would be void. And reapplying would require starting the entire process from scratch, which typically took between 60 and 90 days, assuming no complications. The more I learned about our regulatory vulnerabilities, the more impressed I became with whoever had structured my original employment contract. They'd essentially created a dead man's switch that would shut down our entire operation if I were removed improperly. The question was, did Zachary and Connor understand what they were dealing with? I got my answer the following Monday morning, when Zachary announced a company-wide strategic alignment workshop. The email invitation was filled with corporate buzzwords about right-sizing our human capital and aligning our talent portfolio with our growth trajectory. But the real message was clear: some people were about to lose their jobs. The workshop was scheduled for the following Friday, and attendance was mandatory. Each department head was required to present a value proposition analysis for their team, essentially making the case for why their people deserved to keep their jobs. It was corporate Darwinism dressed up as strategic planning. I spent the week watching my colleagues prepare their presentations with varying degrees of panic and enthusiasm. The engineering team put together an impressive slideshow highlighting their recent patent applications and development milestones. Marketing created a glossy presentation about customer acquisition metrics and brand awareness campaigns. Sales, predictably, focused on revenue generation and client relationship management. Everyone seemed to be competing to prove their indispensability through charts and graphs and bullet points that reduced their professional worth to PowerPoint slides. I took a different approach. I prepared no presentation at all. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched the mood in our office. The entire company gathered in our main conference room, with Zachary presiding over the proceedings like a judge at a talent competition. Connor sat beside him, iPad in hand, no doubt taking notes on who made the cut and who didn't. One by one, each department presented their case for survival. The presentations ranged from desperate to arrogant, with most people trying to strike a balance between confidence and humility that would appeal to our new leadership sensibilities. When it was my turn, I stood up and walked to the front of the room empty-handed. "Margaret," Zachary said, glancing at his agenda, "we're looking forward to hearing about the value proposition for your department." I looked around the room at my colleagues, many of whom I'd worked with for years, and made a decision that surprised even me. "I don't have a presentation," I said simply. The room went silent. Zachary raised an eyebrow, while Connor looked up from his iPad with obvious interest. "No presentation?" Zachary repeated. "No," I confirmed. "I figure after 8 years here, my work speaks for itself. If you don't understand what I do by now, a PowerPoint slide isn't going to change that." It was a calculated risk, either the ultimate power move or professional suicide. But I'd already decided that I wasn't going to beg for my job from people who didn't understand what I did for a living. Zachary stared at me for a long moment, then made a note on his legal pad. "Thank you, Margaret. We appreciate your confidence." The meeting concluded with Zachary promising that decisions would be made by the end of the following week, after he and his team had time to process all the valuable input they'd received. Everyone filed out of the conference room with the uncomfortable awareness that some of them would be cleaning out their desks soon. I spent the weekend in a strange state of calm acceptance. Either I'd made a brilliant strategic move, or I just accelerated my own firing. Either way, I was done playing games with people who treated employees like line items on a budget spreadsheet. Monday morning, I arrived at the office to find an email from Connor requesting an immediate meeting. The subject line read, "Urgent, Transition Planning Discussion." I found Connor and Zachary waiting for me in the small conference room adjacent to Zachary's office. Both men had the uncomfortable expressions of people who'd been tasked with delivering bad news and weren't particularly good at it. "Margaret," Zachary began, "we want to thank you for your years of service to Orion Ventures. Your institutional knowledge and dedication have been valuable assets to this organization." The past tense wasn't lost on me. This was it. "However," he continued, "as we move forward with our restructuring initiative, we've determined that your position represents a duplication of functions that can be more efficiently handled through other means." Duplication of functions. I almost laughed. There was literally no one else in the company who understood our regulatory requirements, let alone held the federal credentials necessary to maintain our licenses. "We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package," Connor interjected, sliding a folder across the table, "along with excellent references and transition support to help you find new opportunities." I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. 6 months of salary. Continuation of health benefits for a year. and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my departure. It was actually a pretty decent package, all things considered. "We understand this is a significant life change," Zachary added, "but we're confident that this decision will position both you and Orion Ventures for future success." I looked up from the severance documents and met Zachary's eyes. He had the expression of someone who thought he was being generous and professional, completely unaware that he was about to detonate his own company. "I'd like a printed copy of the termination notice for my records," I said calmly. "Of course," Connor replied, pulling out a single-page document that officially terminated my employment, effective immediately. I read it carefully, noting the language about redundancy elimination and operational optimization, then signed it without comment. "We'll need you to return your company equipment and access cards today," Zachary said. "Connor will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." I nodded and stood up, shaking hands with both men like we'd just concluded a routine business meeting. "Thank you for the opportunity to work here," I said. "It's been educational." As I walked back to my office with Connor trailing behind me, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what was going to happen next, and I was the only person in the building who did. I packed my personal items slowly and methodically: family photos, a few books, the coffee mug my daughter had given me for Christmas, and a small succulent plant that had somehow survived 8 years of fluorescent lighting. Connor watched nervously as I emptied my desk drawers, probably worried that I was going to cause a scene or make some kind of dramatic speech. Instead, I handed him my company laptop, ID badge, and parking pass without ceremony. "Is there anything else you need from me?" I asked. "I think that covers everything," he replied, clearly relieved that the process was going smoothly. "HR will be in touch about finalizing your benefits transition." I picked up my cardboard box of personal belongings and walked toward the elevator. A few of my former colleagues watched with the uncomfortable expression people get when witnessing someone else's professional execution. Sarah Chen from marketing gave me a sympathetic wave. Dave Rodriguez from engineering pretended to be very interested in his computer screen. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of Connor heading back toward Zachary's office, probably to report on the successful completion of my termination. I wondered how long it would take them to realize what they'd just done. I got my answer sooner than expected. That evening, I sat in my home office with a glass of wine and my laptop, accessing the federal licensing portal that had been part of my daily routine for 8 years. The system recognized my biometric credentials immediately, pulling up a dashboard that showed the status of all 47 permits and licenses registered under my personal identification number. At 11:47 p.m., I initiated the voluntary cancellation process for every single authorization Orion Ventures held. The online forms were surprisingly straightforward. Each license required a brief explanation for the cancellation request. I simply stated that my employment relationship with the license holder had been terminated, and that I was no longer authorized to maintain regulatory credentials on their behalf. The system processed my requests with bureaucratic efficiency, sending automated confirmation emails and scheduling the licenses for deactivation in exactly 72 hours. I forwarded copies of all the confirmations to my personal email account, then shut down my laptop. By Friday morning, Orion Ventures would be operating illegally. Every piece of equipment on our manufacturing floor would be unauthorized. Every shipment to customers would be in violation of export regulations. Every contract with our medical device partners would be null and void. And the beautiful part was that I hadn't done anything vindictive or illegal. I'd simply followed the proper procedures for license cancellation, exactly as the federal regulations required. Wednesday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls on my phone. The first few were from Connor, left between 6:30 and 7:15 a.m., with increasingly frantic voicemails asking me to call him back as soon as possible regarding an urgent operational matter. By the 8th message, he was no longer asking, he was begging. The later calls were from Zachary himself, though his messages maintained a veneer of professional composure even as the panic crept into his voice. "Margaret, We've encountered some unexpected complications with our licensing status. Could you please give me a call at your earliest convenience? I deleted all the messages without returning any of the calls. Instead, I drove to a coffee shop downtown and settled in with my laptop to monitor the situation from a comfortable distance. The first sign of trouble appeared on Orion Ventures' stock ticker around 10:30 a.m., a sudden 3% drop that suggested someone had leaked news about the company's problems. By noon, the drop had accelerated to 8%, and financial news websites were starting to pick up the story. The headlines were variations on the same theme. Biotech company faces regulatory crisis. Orion Ventures halts operations amid licensing issues. Medical device manufacturer scrambles to address federal compliance gap. My personal phone continued buzzing with calls from the office, but I'd switched it to silent mode. I was enjoying my coffee and reading the increasingly alarmed financial coverage of my former employer's predicament. The real drama began around 2 p.m. when I spotted Connor's car pulling into the parking lot of the coffee shop. He'd apparently figured out where I was, either through social media stalking or by calling around to my usual haunts. I watched through the window as he jogged across the parking lot, his tie flying behind him and his usually perfect hair disheveled. He burst through the coffee shop door and spotted me immediately, making a beeline for my corner table with the desperate intensity of a man whose career was imploding in real time. "Margaret," he said, sliding into the chair across from me without invitation. "Thank God I found you. We need to talk." I looked up from my laptop screen, where I'd been reading an analysis of Orion Ventures' stock performance, and gave him my most innocent expression. "Hello, Connor. How are things at the office?" He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to determine whether I was genuinely clueless or playing dumb. "Margaret, all of our licenses have been suspended. Every single federal permit we hold has been flagged for cancellation. Our entire production line is shut down." "That sounds serious," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "Have you contacted our legal department?" "You are our legal department," he practically shouted, drawing stares from other customers. He lowered his voice and leaned forward across the table. "Look, I know you're upset about the restructuring decision, and I understand why you might be feeling..." "Upset?" I interrupted. "Connor, I'm not upset. You made a business decision based on what you thought was best for the company. I respect that." He looked confused by my reasonable tone. "Then why are all our licenses being canceled?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshot I'd saved of the federal licensing portal. According to my termination letter, my employment was ended due to redundancy elimination. Since my personal compliance credentials were redundant, I followed proper federal protocol and canceled them. Connor's face went through several colors as he processed what I was telling him. But you can't just cancel them. They belong to the company." "Actually, they don't," I explained patiently. "Federal licensing credentials are non-transferable personal authorizations. When I was terminated, the regulations required me to notify the appropriate agencies that I was no longer authorized to maintain those credentials on Orion Ventures' behalf. So get them back," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Reapply for them, or transfer them, or whatever you need to do." I shook my head sympathetically. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. Once federal credentials are canceled, the company has to restart the entire application process. New background checks, new technical assessments, new waiting periods. The whole thing typically takes 60 to 90 days, assuming there are no complications." Connor stared at me in horror as the implications sank in. 90 days. We can't operate without licenses for 90 days. We have contracts, shipments, production schedules. "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said encouragingly. "You mentioned that 90% of licensing work could be handled with automated processes and junior associates. Maybe this is a good opportunity to test that theory." The poor kid looked like he was about to cry. I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered his eager dismissal of my administrative work and his confidence that better software could replace 8 years of regulatory expertise. "Margaret," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, "what would it take to fix this? What do you want?" It was a fair question. And I'd been thinking about it since I'd initiated the license cancellations. What did I want? I want you to leave me alone, I said simply. I want to finish my coffee, read the news, and enjoy my unexpected vacation. What you do about your licensing crisis is your business, not mine. Connor sat back in his chair, clearly struggling to process the fact that I wasn't negotiating with him. In his world, everything was a transaction. Everyone had a price or an angle or a deal they wanted to make. The possibility that I might genuinely not care about Orion Ventures' survival hadn't occurred to him. The company could fail, he said, as if I might not have considered this possibility. Hundreds of people could lose their jobs. You're right, I agreed. That would be unfortunate. Of course, Zachary seemed pretty confident about his operational restructuring plan. I'm sure he has contingencies in place for situations like this. Connor pulled out his phone and started frantically typing, probably updating Zachary on our conversation. After a few minutes, he looked up with what I recognized as a last-ditch effort at manipulation. Look, I know we made mistakes with how we handled your situation. But think about all the good work Orion Ventures does. Think about the patients who depend on our medical devices. Are you really willing to let them suffer because of a corporate restructuring dispute? It was a clever approach. Appeal to my sense of social responsibility rather than my personal interests. But it also revealed just how little Connor understood about the situation he'd created. Connor, I said gently, when you fired me for being redundant, what you were really saying is that the work I did wasn't important enough to justify my salary. If that's true, then my absence shouldn't cause any problems for the company or its customers. And if it's not true, then maybe you should have thought about that before you eliminated my position. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that I'd just used his own logic against him. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. I declined it, but it immediately rang again. Connor watched hopefully as I finally answered. Margaret Sutton. Margaret, this is Zachary Hunt. I think we need to have a conversation. Hello, Zachary. I'm actually having coffee with Connor right now. He's been filling me in on some of the challenges you're facing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret, I'm going to be direct with you. We made an error in judgment regarding your position. We'd like to discuss bringing you back to resolve this licensing situation. Bringing me back. Not offering me my job back. Not apologizing for the mistake. Not acknowledging that they'd completely misunderstood what I did for a living. Just bringing me back to clean up their mess. That's generous of you, I replied. But I'm afraid I'm not available. I'm taking some time off to consider my options. Margaret. Zachary's voice took on a harder edge. We both know what's happening here. You're trying to leverage this situation to negotiate a better deal. I respect that. Let's talk about what it would take to make this work for everyone. I looked across the table at Connor, who was watching me with desperate hope, then out the window at the Portland skyline where I'd spent 8 years of my career. Zachary, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. I'm not negotiating with you. I'm not trying to leverage anything. I was fired for being redundant, remember? So I'm being redundant. I'm sitting in a coffee shop, reading the news, and staying out of everyone's way. God damn it, Margaret! I hung up before he could finish the sentence. Connor stared at me across the table, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. You're really not going to help us, are you? Help you with what? I asked. You told me that my work was administrative and could be automated. You said that 90% of licensing tasks could be handled by junior staff with the right systems. I'm just giving you the opportunity to prove that. I closed my laptop and gathered my things, leaving Connor sitting alone at the table. As I walked toward the door, I heard him frantically dialing his phone, probably calling Zachary to report that negotiation had failed. Outside, I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching Connor through the coffee shop window as he paced back and forth while talking on his phone. Part of me felt genuinely sorry for him. He was just a kid who'd gotten in over his head with a situation he didn't understand. But another part of me remembered his confident dismissal of my expertise and his eager participation in my termination. Over the next 2 days, the situation at Orion Ventures deteriorated rapidly. The stock price continued to plummet as more details about the licensing crisis leaked to the press. Several major customers announced delays in their orders pending resolution of the regulatory issues. Two competitor companies issued statements expressing their commitment to proper federal compliance, clearly trying to capitalize on Orion's problems. I monitored the coverage from the comfort of my home office, occasionally fielding calls from former colleagues who wanted to know what was really going on. Most of them had figured out that my termination was somehow connected to the company's current crisis, but none of them understood the technical details of why the licenses couldn't simply be renewed or transferred. Sarah Chen called me Wednesday evening, her voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but everyone's trying to figure out what happened with the licensing situation. Some people are saying you had something to do with it." "I followed proper federal procedures when my employment was terminated," I explained. "That's really all there is to it." "But why can't they just fix it, apply for new licenses or whatever?" I could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. Like most people, Sarah assumed that corporate licenses were like software subscriptions, something you could cancel and restart without major consequences. Federal licensing for medical devices isn't like renewing your driver's license. I explained. It's a complex process that requires specific technical expertise, extensive documentation, and significant time investment. The credentials I held weren't just paperwork, they represented years of regulatory relationship building and compliance history. So how long will it take them to get everything back to normal? If they start the process immediately and everything goes smoothly, probably 3 to 4 months. If there are complications, or if they don't have someone who understands the regulatory requirements, could be much longer. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Margaret, can I ask you something? Did you know this would happen when they fired you?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself, had I known. Not exactly, but I'd certainly understood the potential consequences better than anyone else at the company. I knew that terminating my position without proper transition planning would create problems. I admitted, "I just don't think anyone bothered to ask me about the specifics before they made their decision." Thursday morning brought a new development, a formal investigation by the FDA's Compliance Division. Apparently, someone had tipped off the regulators about Orion Ventures' licensing status, and federal investigators were now reviewing the company's recent operations to determine whether any violations had occurred. The news sent Orion's stock price into free fall. By market close, the company had lost nearly 30% of its value in less than a week. Financial analysts were openly speculating about potential bankruptcy if the licensing issues couldn't be resolved quickly. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in my garden, enjoying the late spring sunshine and the therapeutic benefits of pulling weeds, when a black Mercedes sedan pulled into my driveway. Zachary Hunt stepped out of the driver's seat, looking considerably less polished than he had during our previous interactions. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and he had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't slept much lately. I continued weeding my flower bed as he approached, not bothering to stand up or acknowledge his presence. "Margaret," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't agree to anything," I replied, pulling up a particularly stubborn dandelion. "You showed up at my house uninvited." He stood there for a moment, apparently trying to figure out how to proceed. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." I moved on to the next section of weeds. "You fired me, remember? I'm redundant. I don't work for you anymore." "Margaret, please. The company is in serious trouble. Our stock price has collapsed. We have federal investigators crawling all over our offices. Half our employees are updating their resumes because they think we're going out of business." I looked up at him for the first time since he'd arrived. "That sounds like a management problem, not a redundant employee problem." Zachary ran his hands through his hair, completely destroying what was left of his professional appearance. "Look, I'll be completely honest with you. We made a mistake. A huge mistake. We didn't understand the complexity of what you did." and we didn't anticipate the consequences of terminating your position. I sat back on my heels and wiped my hands on my gardening gloves. That's the first honest thing you've said since you arrived at Orion Ventures. We want to offer you your position back, he continued, speaking quickly as if he was afraid I'd cut him off. Full reinstatement, retroactive pay for the time you've been gone, and a significant salary increase to reflect the critical nature of your role. How significant? 20% above your previous salary, plus a retention bonus. I resumed weeding, considering his offer. It was actually quite generous, all things considered. More money than I'd ever made, job security, and the satisfaction of being proven right about my importance to the company. What about Connor? I asked. Zachary's jaw tightened slightly. Connor's contract has been terminated. His recommendations were not aligned with the company's best interests. So Connor had been thrown under the bus. I wasn't entirely surprised, but I felt a twinge of sympathy for him. He'd been doing exactly what Zachary had hired him to do: find ways to cut costs. It wasn't his fault that neither of them had understood what they were cutting. And the licensing situation? I continued. We're hoping you can help us expedite the reapplication process. Use your relationships with the regulatory agencies, your understanding of the requirements, whatever it takes to get us back to full compliance as quickly as possible. I pulled up another weed and examined its roots. Zachary, even if I came back tomorrow and worked 18-hour days, it would still take months to restore all our licenses. The federal bureaucracy doesn't move quickly, regardless of how urgent our situation is. But you could make it happen faster than anyone else? Probably, but that's not really the point, is it? He looked confused. What do you mean? I stood up and brushed the dirt off my knees, finally giving him my full attention. The point is that you fired me without understanding what I did or why it was important. You reduced 8 years of specialized expertise to administrative work and decided that software could replace institutional knowledge. You made a strategic decision based on incomplete information and overconfidence in your own judgment. And we were wrong, he admitted. Completely wrong. That's why we're here trying to fix it. No, I said, shaking my head. You're here because your mistake had consequences you didn't anticipate. If the licenses could have been transferred seamlessly, or if the federal agencies had rubber-stamped new applications, you'd be celebrating your cost savings right now. You're not sorry about your decision-making process. You're sorry about the outcome. Zachary stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find the right response. He was clearly used to negotiations where everyone had a price or an angle, where problems could be solved with the right combination of money and persuasion. What do you want? He finally asked. Just tell me what it would take to make this right. It was the same question Connor had asked me at the coffee shop, and I gave him the same answer. I want you to leave me alone. Margaret, be reasonable. You can't seriously want to see the company fail. Think about all the people who will lose their jobs. Think about the patients who depend on our medical devices. I think about them all the time, I replied. That's why I spent 8 years making sure we stayed in compliance with federal regulations. That's why I built relationships with regulatory officials and stayed current on changing requirements and made sure our licenses were always up to date. I think about them every time I remember how you dismissed that work as redundant. Zachary's composure finally cracked. God damn it. Margaret, what do you want me to say? That I was wrong? That I'm sorry? Fine, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I should have consulted with you before making any decisions about your position. I should have understood the regulatory requirements before assuming they could be automated. I should have recognized that your expertise was critical to our operations. You should have, I agreed, but you didn't. And now you're dealing with the consequences of that failure. So help us fix it. I looked at him standing in my driveway. This confident young executive who'd arrived at Orion Ventures 6 weeks ago with plans to revolutionize our operations, now reduced to begging his former employee for help cleaning up his mess. Zachary, even if I wanted to help you, which I don't, it wouldn't solve your real problem. What real problem? Your judgment, your decision-making process. Your tendency to make strategic choices based on incomplete information and overconfidence in simple solutions to complex problems. Bringing me back might restore our licenses, but it won't fix the fundamental management issues that created this crisis in the first place. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known him, Zachary Hunt looked genuinely uncertain about something. The board is meeting Monday morning, he said quietly. They're going to want answers about how this happened and what we're doing to fix it. Then you'd better come up with some good answers. I turned and walked toward my house, leaving him standing alone in my driveway. As I reached my front door, I heard him call out one last time. Margaret, please, just think about it. I didn't turn around or respond. I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and settled into my favorite chair to continue monitoring the news coverage of Orion Ventures' ongoing crisis. Friday brought the most dramatic development yet, a surprise inspection by a joint task force of federal regulators. Representatives from the FDA, the Department of Commerce, and the International Trade Administration arrived at Orion's headquarters with a warrant to review all manufacturing operations and recent shipments. The inspection team spent the entire day documenting violations and interviewing employees. By late afternoon, they had issued a formal cease and desist order that prohibited Orion from manufacturing, shipping, or selling any products until full regulatory compliance could be verified. The cease and desist order was the death blow. Orion Ventures' stock price collapsed completely. Trading was suspended, and several major customers formally canceled their contracts citing regulatory concerns. The financial news coverage shifted from speculation about recovery to analysis of potential bankruptcy scenarios. That evening, I received a phone call from Dr. Patricia Hoffman, our former CEO who had retired just 2 months earlier. Margaret, she said, her voice warm and familiar. I've been following the news about Orion. I wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I'm doing well, Patricia. Enjoying some unexpected time off? There was a pause. Margaret, I have to ask, did this situation have something to do with your departure from the company? I'd always respected Patricia's directness. Unlike Zachary and Connor, she actually understood our business and the regulatory environment we operated in. My employment was terminated for redundancy. I explained. When that happened, I followed proper federal protocols for canceling my personal compliance credentials. Jesus Christ, Patricia muttered. They fired you? The person who holds all our licenses? Apparently they felt my role could be automated. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, I'm so sorry. When I recommended that the board bring in someone with operational restructuring experience, I never imagined they'd hire someone who would make such a fundamental mistake. It's not your fault, Patricia. You couldn't have anticipated this. Still, I feel responsible. I should have been more specific about the critical nature of certain positions when I briefed the board about the transition. We talked for another few minutes about the technical aspects of the licensing crisis and the realistic timeline for recovery. Patricia understood better than anyone how complex and time-sensitive the regulatory requirements were. Is there anything I can do to help? She asked before we hung up. Actually, there is, I said. I'm probably going to get calls from reporters over the next few days. If anyone asks you about the situation, I'd appreciate it if you could explain the technical requirements for biotech licensing. Most people don't understand why these credentials can't just be transferred or renewed quickly. Of course. And Margaret, if you decide you want to get back into the industry after this settles down, please give me a call. I have several contacts who would be very interested in someone with your expertise. Thank you, Patricia. I'll keep that in mind. Saturday morning, I woke up to find 3 news vans parked on my street. Apparently, some enterprising reporter had figured out the connection between my termination and Orion's licensing crisis. And the story had evolved from a simple corporate restructuring disaster into a cautionary tale about the dangers of cost-cutting without understanding operational dependencies. I made coffee and watched from my kitchen window as reporters set up cameras and prepared for what looked like live broadcasts. My phone had been ringing constantly since 6 a.m., but I turned off the ringer and let everything go to voicemail. Around 10 a.m., a reporter knocked on my front door. She was young, probably mid-20s, with the eager intensity of someone working on her first big story. "Ms. Sutton? I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 12 News. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your experience at Orion Ventures." I opened the door just wide enough to speak with her. "I'm not giving interviews." "I understand this must be a difficult time for you," she continued, "but our viewers would really benefit from hearing your perspective on what happened. A lot of people are wondering how a company could lose all its operating licenses so suddenly." "The company didn't lose its licenses suddenly," I corrected. "They fired the person who held the licenses and then were surprised by the regulatory consequences. It's really not that complicated." Jennifer's eyes lit up at this confirmation of her story angle. "So you're saying that Orion Ventures terminated your employment without understanding that it would invalidate their federal permits?" "I'm saying that federal licensing credentials are personal and non-transferable, which is clearly stated in the regulations. Anyone who bothered to read them would understand the implications of terminating the credential holder." "And did company management consult with you about these implications before making the decision to eliminate your position?" I considered the question for a moment. "Jennifer, I think the story speaks for itself. A company fired someone for being redundant and then discovered that person wasn't redundant at all. The details aren't really relevant." I closed the door before she could ask any follow-up questions, but I could see her excitement at having gotten a quote that essentially confirmed the entire narrative. Over the next few hours, I watched the local news coverage evolve from speculation to confirmation. The story had everything reporters loved: corporate arrogance, unexpected consequences, and a clear villain in Zachary Hunt. Several stations ran variations on the same basic narrative about a new CEO who'd fired a long-term employee without understanding her importance to the company's operations. By Sunday evening, the story had been picked up by national business news outlets. The Wall Street Journal ran a detailed analysis of how Orion Ventures had accidentally destroyed itself through aggressive cost-cutting. Forbes published an opinion piece about the dangers of corporate restructuring without proper due diligence. Even the New York Times included a brief mention in their weekly business roundup. The coverage was universally critical of Orion's management, particularly Zachary Hunt and his optimization consultant, Connor Blair. Several articles referenced anonymous employee sources who described a pattern of hasty decisions and poor communication during the restructuring process. Monday morning brought the inevitable conclusion to the crisis. Orion Ventures' board of directors announced that Zachary Hunt had stepped down to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately. The company had also filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection and was actively seeking a buyer for its assets. The press release was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism, describing the licensing crisis as an unexpected regulatory transition and Zachary's departure as a strategic leadership change. But between the lines, the message was clear. The company had been destroyed by management incompetence, and the board was desperately trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage. I read the news while sitting in the same coffee shop where Connor had found me the previous week. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was back in the same place where this whole drama had begun to unfold. Except now I was reading about the complete collapse of my former employer instead of its stock price decline. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen. "Saw the news about Zachary. Hope you're doing okay. Let me know if you want to grab coffee sometime." I appreciated the gesture. Sarah was one of the few people at Orion who had always treated me with respect, regardless of whether my work was considered exciting or important by the rest of the company. I texted back, "Thanks for checking in. Coffee sounds good. I'm actually at Riverside Cafe right now if you want to join me." 20 minutes later, Sarah arrived looking tired and stressed. The past week had clearly been difficult for everyone at the company, not just the executives who'd created the mess. "Margaret," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, "I have to ask, did you know this would happen when they fired you?" It was the same question she'd asked me on the phone, but now she was looking directly at me, searching for any sign that I'd deliberately orchestrated Orion's destruction. I knew that eliminating my position without proper transition planning would create serious problems. I replied honestly, I just didn't expect them to ignore the problems when they became obvious. What do you mean? Sarah. I tried to explain the licensing requirements to Connor during our transition meeting. I spent an hour walking him through the federal compliance system, the biometric credentials, the non-transferable authorizations. He dismissed it all as administrative work that could be automated. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. So they fired you even after you warned them about the consequences? They fired me because they thought the consequences were manageable. Zachary and Connor believed that modern business processes could solve any problem, including decades-old federal regulations designed specifically to prevent corporate shell games. And when the licenses started getting canceled, why didn't you help them fix it? I mean, I understand why you were angry, but couldn't you have prevented the company from going under? It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about throughout this entire ordeal. Could I have prevented Orion's collapse? Probably. Should I have? Sarah. Imagine that you're driving a car, and your passenger suddenly grabs the steering wheel and jerks it toward a cliff. Then, as you're flying through the air, they turn to you and say, "Quick, do something to fix this." What would your response be? She considered the analogy for a moment. I'd probably be too busy falling to help them. Exactly. Zachary and Connor created this crisis through their own decisions. Once they'd fired me and canceled the licenses, there was no quick fix available. Even if I'd wanted to help them, it would have taken months to restore our regulatory status. But you didn't want to help them. No, I admitted. I didn't. They'd made it very clear that they considered me redundant and my work unimportant. I saw no reason to contradict their assessment by rushing to save them from the consequences of their own judgment. Sarah was quiet for a while, stirring her coffee and processing what I'd told her. Finally, she looked up with a slight smile. You know, there's a part of me that's actually impressed. I mean, obviously it's terrible that the company failed and people lost their jobs. But there's something satisfying about watching arrogant executives get their comeuppance. I never wanted the company to fail. I said, I spent 8 years building Orion's regulatory compliance program. I cared about our work and our mission. But I also wasn't going to sacrifice my dignity to save people who had clearly demonstrated that they didn't value my contributions. What are you going to do now? It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own mind. The truth was, I had no idea what came next. At 42, I was hardly ready for retirement. But I also wasn't sure I wanted to dive back into the corporate world after everything that had happened. Patricia Hoffman called me last week, I said. She mentioned that she has contacts who might be interested in my expertise. I suppose I'll start there and see what develops. You know, Sarah said, there's been a lot of talk in the industry about what happened at Orion. A lot of people are suddenly very interested in making sure they understand their own regulatory dependencies. Silver lining, I suppose, maybe some good will come out of this mess after all. We talked for another hour about the future of the biotech industry, the lessons learned from Orion's collapse, and the general state of corporate management in America. It was a surprisingly therapeutic conversation, helping me process my own feelings about everything that had happened. As Sarah prepared to leave, she asked one final question. Margaret, do you regret any of it, the way things played out? I thought about Zachary Hunt, probably updating his LinkedIn profile and preparing for awkward conversations with executive recruiters about his brief tenure at Orion Ventures. I thought about Connor Blair, learning the hard way that MBA theories don't always translate to real-world success. I thought about the hundreds of Orion employees who were now looking for new jobs because their executives had made catastrophically poor decisions. I regret that it came to this, I said finally. I regret that intelligent people made such obviously stupid choices. I regret that a good company with valuable technology was destroyed by management incompetence. But do I regret following proper procedures when my employment was terminated? No, I don't regret that at all. Tuesday morning, I received a call from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal who was working on a follow-up story about the broader implications of Orion's collapse. She'd apparently been investigating similar cases where companies had eliminated critical positions without understanding their importance. Ms. Sutton, she said. I'm working on a piece about the hidden risks of aggressive corporate restructuring. Based on your experience, what advice would you give to companies that are considering similar cost-cutting measures? Understand what you're cutting before you cut it, I replied. Most corporate functions exist for reasons that aren't immediately obvious to outside observers. Before eliminating any position, especially one that's been around for years, take the time to really understand what that person does and why it matters. And what about employees who find themselves in similar situations? What should they do if they're targeted for elimination despite holding critical responsibilities? Document everything. Make sure you understand the full scope of your responsibilities and the potential consequences of your departure. And don't assume that management understands these things as well as you do. Some people might say that what you did was vindictive, that you deliberately sabotaged your former employer. Some people might say that. I agreed. But I followed proper federal procedures for credential cancellation, exactly as the regulations require. If following the law constitutes sabotage, then we have bigger problems than corporate restructuring. The interview lasted about 20 minutes, and I found myself enjoying the opportunity to articulate my perspective on what had happened. For weeks, I'd been watching other people tell my story, often getting the details wrong or missing the broader implications entirely. Wednesday brought news that a competing biotech company, NovaCorp Industries, had purchased Orion's intellectual property and manufacturing equipment at a bankruptcy auction. The purchase price was roughly 15% of what Orion had been worth before the licensing crisis began. Several former Orion employees, including Sarah Chen, had been offered positions with NovaCorp. The new company was apparently eager to avoid repeating Orion's mistakes and had made regulatory compliance a top priority in their integration planning. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, NovaCorp's Chief Operating Officer. Ms. Sutton, she said, I hope you don't mind the unsolicited call. We're in the process of integrating the Orion assets, and frankly, we're discovering just how complex the regulatory requirements are for this type of operation. It's a complicated industry, I agreed. Indeed, we've been researching the circumstances that led to Orion's collapse, and your name keeps coming up as someone who really understood the licensing requirements. We'd be very interested in discussing a consulting arrangement, if you're available. A consulting arrangement? It was an intriguing possibility, working on my own terms, setting my own schedule, and getting paid significantly more than I'd ever made as a full-time employee. What kind of consulting are you thinking about? I asked. Initially, we need help understanding exactly what licenses and permits we'll need to operate the manufacturing equipment we purchased. Longer term, we'd like to build a more robust regulatory compliance program so we never find ourselves in Orion's situation. That sounds like a substantial project. It is. We're thinking about a 6-month engagement initially, with the possibility of extending if things go well. The compensation would be considerably above standard consulting rates, given the specialized nature of the work. We talked for another 15 minutes about the scope of the project, the timeline, and the logistics of working with their existing legal team. By the end of the call, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of getting back to work, on my own terms. Dr. Rodriguez, I said before we hung up, I'm definitely interested. When would you like to start? How about Monday morning? We'll send a car to pick you up. Thursday evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, looking out at the Portland skyline and reflecting on the strange turns my life had taken over the past month. 4 weeks ago, I'd been a frustrated employee watching my expertise get dismissed by people who didn't understand what I did. Now I was about to start a lucrative consulting engagement with a company that specifically sought me out because of that same expertise. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. Hello? Margaret, this is Connor Blair. I hadn't heard from Connor since our coffee shop encounter 2 weeks earlier. I'd assumed he'd found another job and moved on with his life. Hello, Connor. How are you? I've been better, he admitted. Look, I know this is probably awkward, but I wanted to call and apologize for everything. The way I handled your situation, the assumptions I made about your work, the whole mess that followed. It was the last thing I'd expected to hear from him. I appreciate that, Connor. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened, and I realize I made some fundamental errors in judgment. I assumed that because I didn't understand what you did, it wasn't important. I treated your expertise like it was just administrative overhead instead of recognizing it as a core competency. Those are expensive lessons to learn. Yeah, they are. I'm actually calling because I'm starting a new position next week with a company that does regulatory consulting for biotech firms. My boss suggested I reach out to you for advice about how to approach this industry differently. The irony was almost too perfect. Connor Blair, the efficiency expert who tried to automate my job, was now working in regulatory consulting. What kind of advice are you looking for? I asked. Honestly, how do I avoid making the same mistakes again? How do I learn to recognize when something that looks simple is actually complex? How do I respect expertise that I don't personally understand? They were good questions, and I found myself genuinely impressed that he was asking them. Connor, the most important thing you can learn is to listen before you analyze. When someone tells you their work is complicated, believe them. When they warn you about potential consequences, take those warnings seriously. And when you're tempted to assume that technology can replace experience, remember what happened at Orion. I will. And Margaret? For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't help us fix the licensing situation. I know that sounds strange, but I think I needed to see the full consequences of my recommendations to really understand how wrong I was. We talked for another few minutes about his new job and the lessons he'd learned from the Orion experience. By the time we hung up, I actually felt optimistic about his prospects. Sometimes people need to fail spectacularly before they can succeed authentically. Friday morning, I drove downtown to meet with the NovaCorp team and finalize the details of my consulting engagement. Their offices were in a modern building overlooking the Willamette River, not far from where Orion's headquarters had been. Dr. Rodriguez turned out to be exactly what I'd hoped for: knowledgeable, professional, and genuinely interested in building sustainable operations rather than cutting costs. She introduced me to their legal team, their manufacturing director, and their head of business development, all of whom had thoughtful questions about regulatory compliance and risk management. We want to do this right from the beginning, Dr. Rodriguez explained as we toured their new facility. We've seen what happens when companies try to cut corners on regulatory compliance, and we have no interest in repeating those mistakes. As we walked through the manufacturing floor, I saw several pieces of equipment that I recognized from my years at Orion. Machines that had once produced life-saving medical devices under my regulatory oversight were now sitting idle, waiting for new licenses and permits that would allow them to resume their important work. How long do you think it will take to get everything properly licensed? Asked James Park, their manufacturing director. If we start immediately and everything goes smoothly, probably 60 to 90 days for basic manufacturing permits. Full export authorization and international compliance will take longer, maybe 4 to 6 months total. And if we run into complications? Then it takes longer. But that's why you hire people who understand the system and know how to navigate it efficiently. James nodded thoughtfully. We appreciate your candor. The previous management at Orion apparently thought they could handle all of this with junior staff and software automation. They learned otherwise, I replied. That afternoon, I signed my consulting agreement with NovaCorp. The compensation was indeed substantial, more than I'd ever made in a year as a full-time employee, for 6 months of project work. But more importantly, I was going to be working with people who understood and valued regulatory expertise. As I drove home from downtown Portland, I couldn't help but smile at the elegant irony of the situation. Orion Ventures had fired me to save money and ended up destroying themselves in the process. Meanwhile, I was about to make more money than ever before, working with their equipment and their former customers, helping a new company avoid the mistakes that had proved fatal to my previous employer. Saturday morning, I was working in my garden when my neighbors stopped by to chat. Ellen Morrison was a retired teacher who'd lived next door for 12 years, and she'd been following the news coverage of the Orion situation with great interest. "Margaret," she said, settling into one of my patio chairs, "I have to tell you, watching all those news reports about your old company has been fascinating. You never mentioned that you were so important to their operations." "I never thought about it that way," I replied, taking a break from weeding to join her on the patio. "I just did my job." "But you must have known that they couldn't operate without your licenses?" "I knew it was a possibility. But I also assumed that intelligent business people wouldn't fire someone without understanding what that person did for the company." Ellen laughed. "You gave them too much credit." "Apparently so." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the late spring sunshine and watching the birds at my feeder. Finally, Ellen spoke up again. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you feel bad about what happened? I mean, I know those executives brought it on themselves, but a lot of innocent people lost their jobs when the company failed." It was a question I'd been asking myself repeatedly over the past few weeks. Did I feel guilty about Orion's collapse? Did I wish I'd handled things differently? "Ellen, I feel bad about the outcome, but I don't feel responsible for it. I followed proper procedures when my employment was terminated. The executives who fired me could have avoided this entire situation by taking 5 minutes to understand the regulatory requirements before making their decision." "But you could have helped them fix it afterward." "Maybe. But think about it from my perspective. They just told me that my work was unimportant and could be automated. Why would I then rush to prove that my work was actually critical? That would have validated their decision-making process while undermining my own professional dignity." Ellen nodded slowly. "I suppose that makes sense. It's just hard to watch a whole company go under because of one bad decision." "It wasn't one bad decision," I corrected. "It was a series of bad decisions, starting with hiring executives who didn't understand the business they were supposed to be running. Firing me was just the final mistake in a chain of poor judgment calls." Sunday evening, I received an unexpected email from Patricia Hoffman. She'd been following the news coverage of Orion's bankruptcy and NovaCorp's acquisition, and she wanted to congratulate me on my new consulting arrangement. "Margaret," she wrote, "I've been watching the industry reaction to the Orion situation, and I have to say, your name has come up in several conversations with other executives. There's a growing awareness that regulatory compliance is more complex and critical than many people realized. I suspect you're going to be very busy in the coming months." She was right. Over the past week, I'd received calls from 3 other biotech companies asking about potential consulting arrangements. Word was apparently spreading that Margaret Sutton understood federal licensing requirements and could help companies avoid Orion-style disasters. Monday morning, I started my new job with NovaCorp, walking into their offices with a sense of purpose and optimism that I hadn't felt in months. For the first time in my career, I was working with people who specifically valued my expertise rather than tolerating it as a necessary evil. Dr. Ike Rodriguez introduced me to the project team and outlined our immediate priorities, understanding exactly what licenses and permits we needed, identifying any regulatory gaps in our current operations, and developing a comprehensive compliance program that would prevent future problems. "We want to build something sustainable," she explained during our kickoff meeting. "Not just the minimum compliance necessary to operate, but a robust system that can adapt to changing regulations and growing operations." It was exactly the kind of project I'd always wanted to work on, regulatory compliance as a strategic advantage rather than an administrative burden. As I settled into my new office and began reviewing the Orion equipment we'd acquired, I couldn't help but think about Zachary Hunt and Connor Blair. I wondered if they understood yet what had really happened at Orion, or if they still thought their failure was just bad luck rather than predictable consequences of poor decision-making. I hoped they'd learned something from the experience. The business world was full of people who mistook confidence for competence, who assumed that enthusiasm could substitute for expertise, who believed that modern technology could solve problems they didn't understand. Sometimes those people got lucky and their mistakes didn't have serious consequences. Sometimes they got unlucky and their companies suffered minor setbacks that could be overcome with time and money. And sometimes, if they were really unlucky, They fired the wrong person and discovered that some mistakes can't be fixed with better software or junior associates or inspirational PowerPoint presentations. As I began my first day at NovaCorp, I opened my laptop and pulled up the federal licensing portal that had been such a central part of my life for the past 8 years. The system recognized my biometric credentials immediately, welcoming me back to a world where expertise mattered and consequences were real. I had work to do,